All right, it's going to be an interesting budget, isn't it? Let's get more expectations then from this one. Then let's speak to Black Sash Executive Director, Rachel Bukasa. We also have Equal Education Law Centre Attorney, Daniel Peter Al-Naddaf. Cosatu Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks, also joins us this evening. And so too does economist Dawie Roodt. Do remember that you can be part of this conversation, and we'd actually like you to be. We'd like to get your comments, your questions, and we'll take some live as well then on WhatsApp. That's 072 110 5584. You can also call us on air, of course. That number is 010 594 6010. We'll continue to put those numbers up for you as well. And be part of this conversation, why don't you? So let's turn to our panel of guests, why don't we then? A very interesting one. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. It's a good evening to all of you. Dawie, let me start with you. You've followed these budgets for some time, haven't you? What's the expectation here? Are we hiking? Are we hiking taxes?
Yes, the short answer is yes. Well, I've been following these budgets for many decades. And at the beginning, I was actually involved in putting the budgets together. And I've been analyzing budgets literally for decades. These budgets of the Minister of Finance.
So when was the first one? Hold on, let's get to that. When was the first one you ever analyzed? Do you remember?
It was probably in the late 1980s while I was an economist at the South African Reserve Bank.
Any similarities then that you see then?
Accounts.
Any similarities between what you see then and what you see now?
Very much so, yes. There are very much similarities. The South African Reserve Bank then, I guess, was a little bit more involved in the compiling of the budget than what it is today. But there's a lot of collaboration between the South African Reserve Bank and Treasury in compiling this budget. What is important for people to understand, the budget is not just a once-off event, it's a continuous process, and they always work on the budget. And I can tell you, the South African budget is perhaps the most transparent budget in the world. You can get just about everything that you want to get about the budget in that piece of paper, or in that document that the Minister of Finance is going to deliver. So it is a really transparent document. You can get everything about the various taxes, state expenditure, the funding numbers and all of that. So, and it has been improved over time as well. But it started off on actually quite a good footing in the 1990s, early 1990s, but it has been improved since then.
Rachel, I wasn't even alive when Dawie was analyzing budgets and delivering to the budget speech in 1980. But this doesn't sound like great news for the middle class or anything lower.
No, I wasn't alive either. It doesn't sound good news at all. And I think, I think it's an important point in terms of when budgets are being drafted that the process is transparent. Working in the civil society space, what we see is that the budget is done in such a way that it essentially leaves behind the most vulnerable and the poor. Every year you're going to see when there are cuts in the budget, it's about the poor. It's resources, it's education, it's health, it's these basic services, it's grants that get increased by 10 Rand. But when there are all these other problems where there's corruption issues, where there's tax evasion at a high level, none of that is a way to bring money in. And then when it's time to say to people, well, if you want all these social assistance resources available, well, we're going to hike tax. And so that's really problematic because it simplifies, it actually makes a problem quite complex, a problem that's actually quite simple, to be quite honest. It's a budget that really doesn't care about those on the ground.
Yeah, that's the hard part then, right? Sorry, say that again, Dawie, very quickly.
That's very untrue what she's saying.
Oh, okay. We're going to get into it. Look, I'm gonna let that happen because I want the people at home to also get involved in this conversation. So I'm going to let everyone first speak, and then we're going to get into that conversation. Let me go to Daniel. There are many splitting needs when it comes to this budget, Daniel. And it's very difficult to ascertain how much further we need to go, whether it comes to education, whether it comes to medical as well, and how we're thinking about NHI. How exactly do we get it right in a society of so many differing priorities?
Well, I think the first thing is this question, I suppose, is a question that's often posed to civil society, which I think rests on an unfair assumption, which is that we need to be stacking certain socioeconomic rights against each other. And exactly as Rachel has said, while I totally agree with Dawie that there is an element of transparency in that we can hear what the budget, what Treasury has decided, what is not transparent is the public consultation process. And that's because there is very little of one. A Treasury actually has by far one of the weakest public consultation processes of any state department in the country when it comes to consultation for the budget. I mean, the budget tips process that actually is only sent to the communications department of Treasury and not actually as part of the consultation process, which, as Dawie mentions, happens throughout the year and far in advance of when we're having these conversations now about decisions that have already been made about poor South Africans. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that there is absolutely scope to be arguing, not only economically, as I think is an important argument, but also legally, according to our constitutional obligations, that we shouldn't be weighing up different socioeconomic rights against each other. Yeah. That it's not only a deferred debt that you make when we create additional opportunity cost by not protecting the rights of people who could have been role players in the economy, who could have been producing wealth, who could have been producing knowledge, but it's also a fundamental violation of our legal obligations. And it's an example with education. It's true that sometimes we might not know exactly how to get it right, but it's not true that we don't know what our obligations are. And for example, Bella, which has been a very contentious issue, which I was just in a portfolio committee on basic education discussing today, is something which creates a mandate on Treasury to fund grade R because it is now compulsory. Treasury fundamentally failed to do so in the medium-term budget policy statement. We asked Treasury in the engagement session that happened during the budget lockup, as economists and as researchers, what the rationale was for absolutely no mention of grade R being funded in the medium-term budget policy statement, and there was no answer. In fact, the Standing Committee on Appropriations have themselves expressed shock that they haven't got any information from Treasury on this. So I would question the assumption of transparency and certainly of accountability.
Yeah, I actually think that it might actually be an issue of prioritization as opposed to just a lack of funding as well in all of that. But I take on your point fully, and I think there needs to be certain allowances and further conversations perhaps. Matthew Parks, you've been a part of this for quite a while. What do you think of the transparency conversation to begin with?
Look, I mean, I would agree with Dawie. We have one of the most transparent budgetary processes in the world. We're able to make inputs to extensive public hearings at Parliament, both in the budget itself and also in the medium-term budget policy statement in the second half of the year. But I also understand the frustration of civil society colleagues too, because often Treasury, to be honest, is kind of allergic to inputs in the public. And look, that's natural to an extent because they have to be a bit strict with anybody who's managing finances has to be a bit strict, has to kind of manage expectations. They've got to manage quite difficult contradictory demands, and all of the demands are legitimate. They're all equally pressing. We can say as Cosatu, we have managed at times to make an input, make a difference. So the SOD grant was introduced during COVID. It was stopped. We managed to intervene with other organizations to get it reinstated. We managed to also kind of introduce the debt relief package for Eskom a couple of years ago. We managed to introduce the two-part pension reforms, which came into effect last year. So it's a mixed bag. We think at times Treasury would do better to listen, but I think also there is a need for a bit of a more inclusive process for it, because it's fine to have the parliamentary hearings next week and a few weeks after that. But we need to have a bit of a longer discussion, because I think all of us roughly want the same thing. We want to see the stabilization of the state. We want to see the capacitation of public services. We want to see the economy growing. We want to see businesses thriving, jobs being created, inequality, poverty being tackled. So I think we do need to have a much more extensive process that says throughout the year, not just twice a year. Throughout the year, let's have the engagements and see how we can have a more meaningful thing, because I think 90% of us agree on the fundamental objectives, and I think we do need to do a bit better while still understanding the bureaucracy of the nature.
Matthew, how will we be able to get that right, though? If we already only have a medium-term budget policy framework, a statement that comes out in October, then the budget in February. In between, if we had consultations, we wouldn't get anything done, though, would we? It would mean that our budget would take 4 years or something to get right.
Look, you can do both. So the budget is tabled tomorrow at Parliament. It comes into effect on the 1st of April. Parliament will pass it a few weeks, a month later after that. But, throughout the next 6-7 months until the MTBPS in November, you can have the discussions. Doesn't mean it's going to come into effect immediately, but it would be useful to have a discussion to say, where do we think we need to reduce expenditure? Where do we need to increase expenditure? What are the possible additional revenue streams that could come into play? Can it be from other institutions? Can it be from the private sector? What are the ways to grow the economy, to tackle leakages? What are the ways to create jobs? And I think all of us recognize that there's many good things the government has done, but also many things that need to be fixed. So, for example, if you look at the public employment programs, I think all of us would love to see them being revamped. I think everybody would have some good ideas. So we should have a bit more of a less pressured, a bit more of an inclusive, meaningful process.
All right, let's. You know what? I'm gonna ask Dawie to respond very quickly. Dawie, I know you have a burning response, particularly to the transparency issue, but we do have a call as well that we want to take just now. So I'm going to ask you, Dawie, if you can just be quick on just the response, particularly to whether there is sufficient transparency and ability to add to the budget.
Well, I think this is a bit of a philosophical answer. I think, yes, there is sufficient participation by the public. It's called democracy. As far as I'm concerned, the budget goes to the heart of a democracy. And you vote for a political party because you ask them what taxes they're going to levy and where they're going to spend the money. And that's how you make a decision who you're going to vote for. So as far as I'm concerned, there's quite a lot of...
Is there enough in manifestos, though? Is there enough in manifestos today?
No, of course not. No, we've got political parties that are largely economically illiterate. They don't understand the economy. That's why they say all these stupid things. They believe, they promise us everything. They promise us the sun and the moon and the stars, but they never tell us where the money is going to come from. But that's what we have to put the pressure on political parties to tell us where the money is going to come from for all these promises that they are making.
Time to put pressure. Time to put pressure. Paula in Pretoria, good evening to you. Your comments.
Good evening, sir. Yes, mine, it is about the money. The minister must allocate money to the middle class. We are working for the government, but our kids, they don't get the funding from NSFAS. Now they have the middle class, but still, under the middle class, they are giving them the loan, and still giving them the loan. It is difficult for them to access the loan. They want the documents, they submit, but they keep on rejecting them. Yeah. They must allocate enough money for the middle class because we are working for the government so that our kids can access tertiary education.
Yeah.
They are struggling. They don't get the grants, but we are working for the government. Even the near NSFAS, they still exclude them. They said you must be in the bracket of 600, but still under the same bracket, they are still denying them the opportunity. The varsity, they accept them because they are performing, but coming to funding, it is a problem. So the minister must also think for us, the middle class, yes.
Paula, thank you so much for that question. Daniel, please keep that in mind as well. I'm going to ask you about that a little bit later on, of course, as we talk about priorities, NSFAS, the middle class, etc. as well. Very quickly, Billy in Port Shepstone, you also have a question or a comment for us?
Yes, good evening. I produce some surgical products, and for so many years I am trying to get hold of the minister, although I met her and she said she wants to have a one-on-one meeting with me. It's gone 3 years now. I can't get hold of her. And my products will save water, will save electricity, it will prevent cross-infection, and it's got a huge potential for exports. And the company I work for, I gained my experience there and my expertise. And I also produced a new abdominal soap for surgery. And nobody wants to listen to me. I went to CEDA offices in Port Shepstone. I think they don't like me. I went to TI in Durban, Musgrave, and I even had a telephone conference with Musgrave in Durban, Cape Town, and Pretoria. It was a total waste of time. These government agencies need an audit urgently. I am so frustrated. I don't know what to do now. I've done all the work. I've done the unofficial trials in the hospitals at my own expense. And these people are wasting our time.
Yeah.
What do I do next? I need the Minister for Small Business to contact me urgently.
Yeah, it's a very significant and very interesting one there, because small businesses is supposed to be the heart of growth. And there's a high chance you'll hear from Minister Enoch Godongwana tomorrow speaking about how small businesses need to continue to be supported, but we then have issues like that. Billy, appreciate your comment then as well there, and hopefully it's words then to the Finance Minister as well as the Small Business Development portfolio as well. Rachel, let me get your thoughts here. Are we getting a sense that the middle class continues to be the one impacted, affected, brought down, and yet we're supposed to be also the ones bringing this economy up as much as possible then as well?
Sure. I just wanted to make 2 points before getting to your question.
Sure.
One, I think on the issue of, not to take us back, but on the issue of transparency, I think the issue, no one is arguing that the consultation takes place. What is being argued here is the meaningfulness of that consultation and whether it's a tick box exercise or not. And as the previous caller just said, I think he raises an important point, though, in a different context. Dawie at some stage said, politicians do all these things and not telling us where money comes from. But civil society has said, for example, about Sash, along with other people in the Basic Income Coalition, we've said we want a basic income grant. Let us show you where the money can come from. You bring your economists. This is to the president and the minister of finance. In the room, we bring ours and we'll show you how we've modeled this and this can work. And the simple answer is that they refuse to listen, not because there aren't options out there, but simply the fact that if they acknowledge that different options exist, it now becomes a requirement to honor that. So as to the issue of the middle...
Let me ask you about
Sure.
that, Rachel, before you continue to your second point then. If they listened, and I'm not saying they shouldn't, hear me out. If the finance ministry went on to listen to every cooperative, every economist, every single person, would we get a budget done?
So I think what the issue at the heart of the issue here is that if you're going to call for consultation, then there's a presumption that there's a legitimate good faith of taking that input into consideration.
Fair enough.
Instead, what we see now is that there's a political will of certain things and no political will for others. So submit, don't submit, come to consultations, don't come to consultations. The decisions have already been made. That's the problem here. And in fact, in the meeting I'm referring to, the answer is, if you decide that we're crazy and this can't work, that's absolutely fine. But the thing is, if you're going to call for consultation, then you have to give them meaningful thought and make decisions towards it. That's not what it appears to be right now.
Yeah. Your second point?
About the middle class, I think, in as much as I hear completely the worry about the middle class, due to my line of work, our concern, can you imagine how much more the lower class struggles, the people on the ground struggle. It's a certain issue of where the budget comes and to take the exercise that, we're looking after the poor. Oh, let's add the grant by 10 Rand. But is that meaningful on the ground? And so those are the kind of questions we have to ask. We have to move past the rhetoric of it was done. We have to ask, was it meaningfully done? Because giving someone 370 Rand, even though you promised a basic income grant and then pretended you didn't, is really problematic as a country. So we have to move past the rhetoric and ask the meaningfulness of these interventions.
It's not helping everyone on the ground, is it though, Matthew Parks?
Well, look, I think there are some areas of progress, there are some areas of difficulty. Look, it's natural democracy to kind of focus on the negative issues, and that's fine, because you need to put government keep it on its toes. You need to keep pushing to do better, and it's natural to be irritated and frustrated given the decade of state capture, of corruption, what we see in many municipalities, and SOEs, etc. But I think we also should be fair that there has been huge strides as well since '94. The fact that government, with all the limitations on its resources, provides some sort of social security, with all the imperfections of it, to 27 million South Africans, that's a lot. The SOD grant was introduced. Again, I'm not discounting all the imperfections of it, but it's an effort. There's been, significant amounts of money spent on public employment programs, again, with lots of issues. But I think what we need to do really is to say, how do we turn the corner? Because the fundamentals should keep all of us awake at night. And I'm sure they do. An economy stumbling along at 1% GDP growth rate, when we need at least 3% to reduce unemployment. An unemployment rate of about 41.6%, youth unemployment of about 70%. That with all the effort and all the strides the government has made since '94, of spending about 60% of the budget investing in working class communities, and all the different investments, we're still the most unequal society in the world. We still have deep levels of poverty, of inequality. And despite all the efforts of government to deal with state capture and corruption, we still have really entrenched levels of crime and corruption and so forth. So I think there is good things being done. We shouldn't discount them. But again, the fundamentals of 4 out of 10 South Africans unemployed, of really struggling public and municipal services, of SOEs struggling, should really say that we all need to do much better. And society's got the right to be irritated and to be impatient. It's got the right not to trust the state.
Yeah.
And it's got the right to hold government accountable and expect better. And I think that's the issue. At times we feel that Treasury and the government is a little bit too business as usual approach, when we can see multiple burning fires and we don't have unlimited political runway. We've got to deal with issues quickly because you can really see problems growing all the time. You know, about 10 years ago, we had about 10% of municipalities in financial trouble.
Yeah.
Today, it's about 70%. We have municipalities who can't pay staff, who don't pay pension funds. We've seen municipalities like Ditsobotla in the northwest, I forget the one in the Free State, which covers Frankfurt, failing to provide municipal services. So companies close, they retrench workers. And if you go to Lichtenberg or to Frankfurt, those communities are already very poor. And for them to lose Clover dairy plants, it plunges those communities into absolute poverty. So I think the point is we've got to do much better. We appreciate what's been done, but we've got to do much more, much faster.
Daniel, it feels like we're just beating on the government the whole evening. Surely there's something good they've done.
Look, I mean, without sounding trite, I don't think it's important for us to continuously congratulate fish for swimming. But, you know, even having said that, I think that, you know, as much as we would want government to do its job, I don't think government would perhaps very much appreciate a civil society sector that was just singing the praises of the state. And in fact, part of the reason we exist as civil society is because there are so many fundamental gaps in implementation by the state. So yes, of course, there's been progress. I would say perhaps that, you know, the SRD grant is an interesting example to choose, considering that, you know, the court case, which has led to a lot of this discussion, involved the court saying that it was unthinkable that government, and specifically Treasury, in the court's own words, hadn't done the proper preparation to fulfill a basic obligation. But yes, there are things that the government is doing well. One thing we would actually say that the government has done well in the past is reflect a commitment to socioeconomic rights through its government policy. And it's exactly for that reason that we find it very, not just frustrating, but unlawful that those policy directives which are passed as acts of parliament are stymied by Treasury through the back door by not allowing the fiscus that's necessary for those laws to be implemented. So yes, the government does do some things right. And we wish that Treasury was giving the capacity to government to continue to do better things as well. And hopefully that will change tomorrow.
Don't congratulate a fish for swimming. Wow, Daniel. What a rough evening looks like we're going to have here. All right, folks, we're going to just take a quick ad break. We're going to come back to this. I want us to think about what vicious circle we're finding ourselves in here and what priority comes first. We usually have the chicken and the egg situation, as it were. And I'm going to unpack exactly what I mean by that. And we'll give you that conversation right after this. Remember, you can be part of this conversation as well, whether it be on WhatsApp. Send us your messages on 072 110 5584. That is the numbers, of course, on your screen. You can also call us 010-594-6010. We're back right after this. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for joining us here then on Newsfeed PM, the late edition, unpacking the budget then as we preview it for tomorrow. The Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana anticipated to bring that out tomorrow afternoon. Then we'll have that for you live here on Newzroom Afrika. So please don't change that dial either. So we're getting a preview. We're getting your comments to be a part of this conversation as well. And I'll introduce our guests in just a moment, of course, then. But very quickly, let's go to our WhatsApp conversations as well that we've indeed had so far then as well. Today, we start off there with Sir Nzwa, who says the Finance Minister must prioritize education and health. Ultimately, sir, those are the two things that always get prioritized as well. But in which direction should he be going exactly when it comes to that? He also says he must also cut the pay-as-you-earn tax from public servants like educators and nurses. That's from Sir Nzwa on the WhatsApp line. We also have Lebu Munaun saying then that let's agree that it's all a balancing act. Health, education and water projects, 1, 2, equally important is the servicing of debt. 3, the capacity of state-owned entities, efficiency, as well as capacity for elements like Transnet to drive growth. 4, activate aggressively small business department grant initiative to unlock as well as drive creation. That's one message as well that we're getting. Sanjay Luchtman, FBI Foundation, saying the Finance Minister firstly should cut the salaries of the presidency and all ministers by half. Overpaid with no performance is what Sanjay says. He should scrap BEE, right person for the right position, irrespective of color. Many question marks on that one then, Sanjay, but nonetheless, regards from Fairs then. Fairs saying, Dear Minister, please provide funds for the total eradication of corruption and be managed. This will provide resources for everything we need in our country. Let's turn over to Armstrong as well, who joins us from Malamulele as well. Armstrong, your comment.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening, Armstrong. What's your comment this evening?
My comment is that the Minister of Finance must prioritize the rural development in terms of making sure that electricity is available in all rural areas. He must also improve agriculture, and he must prioritize do away with the corruption that exists at Sasalamani police station in Malamulele.
All right, corruption is being a key one of those. In terms of agriculture, then, what do you want to see fixed very quickly, Armstrong?
What I would like to say is that we have got plenty of land in Limpopo where agriculture can be practiced, you know. The Department of Agriculture can make sure that every village has got a scheme where crops are cultivated, where employment will be created, and everything will be available for people to live on, more especially food, you know.
From your lips to the finance minister's ears, hopefully there. Armstrong, thank you so much for that message then and your comments and thoughts then as we head towards this budget. We've been saying that we've got Black Sash Executive Director Rachel Bukasa, Equal Education Law Centre Attorney Daniel Peter Al-Naddaf, Cosatu Parliamentary Coordinator Matthew Parks, as well as economist Dawie Roodt, who are joining us then as well. Again, you can send your comments, questions, etc. on WhatsApp. Also call us as well, and we will have those numbers on the screen for you. Folks, I don't know if you have any comments directly to that to begin with, but I also want to kick things off in this segment just by saying, is it not just a vicious cycle, Dawie? We've got a small tax base, not enough tax revenue, so you tax us more and ultimately not create enough jobs, and therefore still creating the small tax base that you've had for the longest time. Is it not just a vicious circle?
Okay, well, I was asked to join this panel tonight so we can discuss the budget. We have not really discussed the budget. We're jumping from one topic to the other topic. In fact, during the break, I spoke to my other panelists here, and it's very clear to me that they do not understand the budget. They haven't got a clue what's going on in the budget. They don't even understand the basics of economics. So if you allow me, and let me just give you sort of the basic background of what's going on in the economy, what's going on in the budget. Let's talk about the budget.
Okay. Sure, let's do that. I mean, I was asking about the budget. I was asking about the budget with regards to prioritization as well. But all right, nonetheless, tell me about the budget, Dawie.
Let's see what is going on. We've got an economy that is hardly growing. This economy is supposed to fund the state. The state is supposed to take this money and spend it on all sorts of things. Now, the tax burden in South Africa is quite excessive, especially on a very narrow tax base. So rather few people pay just about all the taxes. This money that the state basically spends goes mostly to social expenditure, to things like, for example, 30 million people that get an income from the state every month. The state debt burden currently is standing at about 75% of GDP, and it is going up. And I can promise you, if it keeps on going up like this, we are going to get into very, very deep trouble. What are our options? Macroeconomic options. What are the options to the Minister of Finance? Well, the most obvious thing that we need to do, we need to grow the economy. But with the current policies in place, the economy is just not going to grow fast enough to support this massive, huge budget, this huge state machinery. So that means that we have to, if we try to increase taxes, if we increase any of the taxes, except with perhaps for value-added taxes, if we increase any of those taxes, it will cause huge damage to the South African economy. That means we have to cut back on state expenditure. We can't do that because the Cosatu, for example, is demanding excessive increases to the salaries of civil servants. In the meantime, the state keeps on borrowing more and more money. And if they keep on borrowing more and more money, we have to pay more interest on state debt. Now, listening to all your callers, I'm listening to most of your callers, I'm listening to my other panelists here, and all they can tell me is where they're going to spend money on A, B, and C. But they can't tell me where the money is is going to come from. They can't tell me how the economy is going to grow to keep on funding this massive state machinery that is highly inefficient and in many cases highly incompetent and quite often quite corrupt as well. We are in very deep trouble. Let us understand that. And we can't playing around, shifting the deck chairs around on the Titanic. We are on our way to getting into serious financial trouble if we don't start getting this economy to grow and if we don't start cutting back on state expenditure. We simply cannot afford this massive state machinery. There are two major state expenditure items that we need to cut back on. That is the wage bill, and that's primarily Cosatu causing this. The wage bill is far too excessive. The civil servants are getting far too much increases, well above the inflation rate. And the second one is the state-owned enterprises that's been run into the ground financially and operationally. And there's a third one, actually, that one can add, and that's municipalities that are getting deeper and deeper into trouble. Now we're talking about the budget.
Dawie, you know, I don't know where exactly we lost you in terms of not speaking about the budget, because as we spoke about the transparency thereof, prioritizing in terms of spending, stabilization of the state being a key part of it. We even spoke about the Bella Act very shortly, did Daniel. So it's all spending priorities. If you're saying to me that, yes, we haven't discussed where the money is going to come from, well, that's exactly what I'm trying to ask you. And I'm saying to you, it's a vicious circle because we've got a small tax base, not enough tax revenue. We tax each other more. We don't then create the jobs that we need. But ultimately, we then still continue to have a small tax base. So it's this vicious circle that we ultimately are in. How do we fix it? So give me a solution.
Okay, the reality is, let me try to explain this. The reality is that the bulk of state expenditure goes to social expenditure.
Yeah.
Things like, for example, the various grants. Let me repeat the number. There are 30 million people getting an income from the state every month, while there are less than 15 million people working in the private sector, in the productive sector. That is the problem. Now we can decide whether we can spend more on education or more on health services. That's not the point here. The point is we're spending too much for what the tax burden can actually carry. This economy is not going to grow with existing policies that we have in place. We have to understand that. Now, we can argue where the money is going to go to, and how are we going to spend the money, how are we going to set the priorities. But we must understand the economy is simply not growing fast enough to carry this massive burden. That is the very important point that we all must understand.
So you're talking about input. Rachel?
Sure. I think I can reassure my fellow panelists that there's a couple of master's degree on this panel, so we understand quite clearly. I think Dawie represents how budget decisions are made in this country. Very black and white, with very little understanding of human suffering. He's completely right. 30 million people are receiving grants and only 15 million working. But whose fault is that? Why is the assumption that people are willingly wanting grants instead of jobs? People are on grants as a reflection of government's failure to keep up with the job creation mechanisms they've promised. If you and I had the option of 350 Rand or 370 Rand or a salary, we would take a salary. Why do we assume that that same logic would not apply to people because they're poor? And so you're completely correct, but the reflection of the need for the grants is a reflection on government's failure to make sure that there are adequate job creation mechanisms in place. So to blame people now for a problem that government itself has created is actually quite a bit hypocritical, to be honest.
Daniel?
Yeah, I think Rachel's covered me on the ad hominems. I don't think it's necessary for me to go too much into my own credentials, but my background other than law is in economics. And I think it's important to note that economics is, as a social science even, not a particularly cold or pure science. It's riddled with and fundamentally based on several ideological assumptions which differ across economists. So you'll have Dawie tonight telling us something, but I could easily compare that to economists from the AIDC who are saying the opposite, and that it's actually economically in the interest of South Africa to raise debt. Now, as Dawie's mentioned, he's been working longer than he's been alive, right? So I'm not coming to tell him about his own knowledge and education, and I would appreciate if he wouldn't do the same for us. But what I can tell you is that the budget process is firstly not only a purely economic process, as I've already mentioned before, right? There are legal obligations. South Africa has an obligation not only in terms of the legislation that I mentioned, but under the international legal obligation of non-retrogression, we have an obligation not to backslide on the commitments we've made of socioeconomic rights. And stagnated increases, which are below inflation, are effective stagnation and effective decreases of our socioeconomic rights obligations. So what I definitely can tell you as a lawyer is that the budget process right now is not passing the muster of constitutional and participatory democracy that it's supposed to. But the second thing is that it's exactly as Rachel mentioned. You know, what we're generally speaking about in cases of austerity is comparing different types of expenditure which we have currently versus an attempt to try settle debt. And as Dawie's mentioned in between the bluster, one of the main reasons for the austerity decision taken by Treasury is because we're currently paying very large amounts of interest on our debt. Very few people dispute that. What we are saying, and it's very painful that we have to argue for the rights of people that are protected in the Constitution from an economic basis. But what we are saying is that the debt that a society incurs by not looking after the socioeconomic rights of its people, by fundamentally dismantling the systems which will do something to protect the rights of people, is exactly the kind of society, and that's exactly the kind of debt that's going to create even more people requiring social grants in future, even more people who aren't able to productively contribute to the economy. No one here is saying that there are limitless amounts of resources. What we're saying is that if we're weighing up opportunity costs, it's actually a very good idea to rather incur debt now that allows people to be productive in future than to stave off debt that we currently have and not do it in future. And it's completely fine for Dawie to disagree. But our presumptions don't come from just a lack of understanding. They come not only from many economists who fundamentally disagree with him, but also from what's very clear to us on the ground, that when people are left to their own devices, in the most literal sense, when they are left to survive on their own, the worst thing you can expect is for them to, and the last thing you can expect is for them to be contributing meaningfully to the economy. So, you know, whether we're speaking about orthodox interpretations of economics or we're speaking about our legal obligations, it's very clear that Treasury and perhaps Dawie need to have a little bit more humility and look at what's happening on the ground, because it's not agreeing with the presumptions that he's making.
Matthew, that allegation was put forward that Cosatu are the ones that have... Dawie, you wanted to say something very quickly before I hand it over to Matthew?
I'll be very quick. I'm not saying people should die of hunger. I'm not saying taking away people's grants. Without a doubt, I'm not saying that. We've got the responsibility as South Africans to look after our fellow South Africans. But let me make a prediction here, and that is that the poor people are going to lose their grants. In fact, that is already happening because the grants are increasing below the inflation rate because the economy is just not growing. And let me just ask you this, Daniel. You're mentioning the word of austerity. Well, what is the fiscal deficit? You don't know what it is, but let me help you out. It is 5%. It's 5% to GDP. That is
actually, I was just about to answer that, but it's fine.
That is an expansionary budget. It is not an austere budget. It's an expansionary budget.
It is absolutely not an expansionary budget. I'm sorry.
And the economy is growing at 1%, and you're
fundamentally incorrect. To allow people, if you are saying that our largest expenditure in our budget, other than debt repayments, is on the social wage, right? We agree on that.
No, it is on education, by the way. It's education, by the way.
And on social protection. Yes, absolutely. I'm from education, right? If it's on socioeconomic rights. And what we know, and if you looked at the budget, you would see that the expenditure on education is in real terms decreasing, even if you only use CPI as the metric for measuring that.
Well, what is expansionary?
How can you possibly say
what is an austere budget?
That it's an expansionary budget?
What is an austere budget? Tell me, what is an austere budget?
Dawie,
give me a definition.
Dawie, I think if you have the answers, and you've been doing this since Daniel and I were...
I have the answer.
Then why haven't you fixed things?
Well, I have the answer. When debt goes up, debt to GDP goes up, you have an expansionary budget. As simple as that. So don't call it an austere budget. It is not. It is an expansionary budget. We've had an expansionary budget for many decades in South Africa, in fact. Don't mislead people. It is not an austere budget. It's an expansionary budget.
I think the only person misleading someone is trying to convince South Africans that their real-term decreases in social protections are expansionary. I mean, we can argue about terminology and nomenclature, but the reality is on the ground. And I think you're wrong on that
folks,
as well.
I'm going to interject just here. I don't want us to lose the audience at home as well with parts of this. And I think we all understand from this that this is why this topic matters so much. It is people's everyday lives that are being impacted and affected, and ultimately then the country as a whole. We're going to come back in just a moment. And when I come back, I'm going to head over to you, Matthew Parks, because the word, of course, is that Cosatu in itself has raised, its wants, needs, and desires for its workers above what the government can afford. We'll get into that in just a moment or two. Do stay with us. We'll wrap up the debate right after this. Even in the ad break, I promise you, even in the ad break, very quickly, we could even show you our guests right now. They were even arguing just a moment ago. This is why this matters so much. It is about you every single day. How do we advance the economic agenda? Just today, we saw the unemployment rate hitting 31.9%. Yes, it's lower than the 32.1% we had. That's minuscule in the context of things. Right? It's not enough to ultimately grow this economy. So how exactly does Enoch Godongwana then aid the process and ensure that we get this right? Rachel Bukasa, Daniel Peter Al-Naddaf, Matthew Parks, Dawie Roodt, all joining us as well this evening. We're going to try and close out this conversation in the next couple of minutes. Very quickly, we do have a call, though, from Moiketsi from Tabanchu. Moiketsi, your comment on the budget, please.
How are you?
Fantastic, thank you. Your comment.
Yes, my comment is, ma'am, I'm asking the minister to prioritize the public servants. They must stop playing hide and seek, and they must stop playing with the public servants. On this wage negotiations, we are pleading with the minister to give the public servants what they have asked, the 6%, and then the 12%.
Well, that's exactly the conversation we've been trying to have actually here. Matthew, that's actually straight at you then ultimately. If we give public servants the high increases, one, increases inflation are possibly there, also increases the fiscus. That's the economic debate. That's the budgetary debate. Of course, the human element can't be ignored because people really need it. How do we manage both? How do we balance this?
Yeah, look, it's unfortunate Dawie has chosen to attack the other panelists. It'd be a little bit useful if we could have a constructive debate. I know it might be difficult for him, but it's fine.
Don't worry, he's trying to be constructive.
I think he could try a little bit harder, Perhaps he could even go to Kylie to Mitchell's Plain to see what real people's economics is like, not just the economics at university. But look, I think it's a misnomer, and to be honest, it's actually quite disingenuous to say that the wage bill's out of control. Because if you go to Treasury's budget figures, not my figures, Treasury's, the wage bill has fallen from a high of 40% to 35% for the past 15 years. And in the past 2 years, it's gone to 31%. We see huge amounts of vacancy. This is partly why you have long queues at Home Affairs, because you've got a 60% vacancy rate there. We've seen the police headcount drop by 15%. We've seen nurses having to cover vacancies. To say the headcount is out of control also is a myth. It's not true, because in '94 we had 34 million South Africans, about 1.2 million public servants. Today the population has nearly doubled to 64 million South Africans. The headcount is about 1.2 million. And you're seeing the consequence because you've got a rising numbers of health workers to patients, of teachers to learners, etc. It's also a myth to say we should pay people peanuts. I'm sure Dawie wouldn't want to earn what a police officer makes. He doesn't even make 200,000 Rand a year. I doubt he'd want to earn what a nurse makes, where she can barely afford her own house. And if you pay people peanuts, and most public servants are not bureaucrats pushing papers. They're doctors, they're nurses, they're paramedics, they're defense force personnel, correctional service officers, etc. People, if you compare their salaries to what their peers get in the private sector, you'll find actually the private sector pays them much more. But I think for us, the critical thing is, because we all want to see the state work, we want to see the economy growing, we want to see businesses thriving, we want to see jobs being created. So what do we do? And I think for us, that's a pity that Dawie chose to bark up a tree and not focus on the fundamentals. We've got to fix the state, because if the state is working, if Home Affairs doesn't have long queues, if schools deliver quality education, if the NPA can deal with corruption, if the courts don't have backlogs, society benefits, both businesses, both workers, both communities, from an efficient state. If the state can help fix the blockages to the economy, from ensuring we have reliable and affordable electricity, to ensure that Transnet can deliver mining, manufacturing, agricultural goods to our ports, to make sure the metro rail is operational so workers can get to work on time, so the business can be productive. Those for us are the key things. So I think for us, it's about fixing the state, growing the economy, stimulating it, giving support for SMEs, for export sectors.
Sure.
Also creating public employment programs to help people move from the 12 million unemployed to reversing the ratios of people receiving social grants. But I think we need to have a sober discussion. We need to do the hard issues, because I think for far too long we've been kicking the can down the road. We've been putting a plaster on the wound. And Dawie is right. If we don't deal with these fundamental ticking time bombs, we're all going to be in serious trouble. And I think for us, that's the biggest frustration. Treasury doesn't move fast enough. Government doesn't move fast enough. And consequently, all of us are going to be in real trouble if we don't get things moving quite quickly.
Folks, I don't know, but I want to just say to all of you that I think you all have very extremely relevant parts of this conversation that need to be attacked. And I think it's going to be about hearing each other, and so that the discourse across the nation as well is clear, and hopefully National Treasury hears us. I've got 30 seconds left for each of you. Let's hear closing remarks. I'm going to start off with you, Rachel.
So I think our expectations just in terms of the budget speech is that aside from whatever promises being made, we would like to see clear timelines. We'd like to see timelines. We'd like to see the way things can be measured and success levels down the line, because what happens a lot is this one gets this one, this one gets this one, and then that's it. Yeah. And then the follow-up doesn't happen then. So we'd like to see that, and we'd really like to see a real and true commitment to implementing a basic income grant.
Yeah. Daniel?
Well, yeah, I think maybe to separate expectations from hopes. I think expectations, even hopeful expectations, are perhaps to meet some of the legislative requirements that already exist on Treasury in order to fund mandates that exist through acts of Parliament. Hopes is that Treasury adopts a recognition that's even accepted in most orthodox economics that austerity budgeting is not conducive to growth, and that if we want to grow our tax base, we need to increase spending. Yeah, that's our expectations and probably our hopes as well. Thank you.
Dawie?
I'm very concerned about high levels of unemployment, high levels and rising levels of poverty in South Africa. And I'm afraid that is likely to continue, and it might get even worse if we follow the current trajectory.
Come on, give us a positive message. Come on, Dawie, something positive.
But here's the positive. Here's the positive messages. Here's a positive message to my fellow panelists. I give free economic classes Saturday mornings. They're welcome to join.
I'll join you too, Dawie. I'll join you too. I'll be there as well. Why don't I? Matthew Parks.
Yeah, look, I think first, 4 basics. Fix the state, especially Eskom and Transit and Metro Rail, to help grow the economy. Give support to the economy, stimulate it through the infrastructure programs, through support for SMEs. Ramp up our public employment programs to help get people, young people especially, into the labor market. But also to capacitate SARS. SARS has shown, if you want a good news story, that you can rebuild the state. Give support to SARS to deal with tax evasion. So we don't need new taxes. We don't need to increase VAT. We need to capacitate SARS to deal with tax evasion, and that will help to ensure that the state has the money it needs to fund public services.
Well, that was fun. Thank you to all of you this evening. It's been an absolutely great evening. Wonderful conversation. I think very vibrant, and that's exactly what our country is going to have to need. If we're going to get transformation, if we're going to get this country going, if we want to get the economic agenda bright, if we want to get growth up, all of those elements, it's these kind of conversations that need to be had and built upon. So I appreciate all of you for joining us this evening. Rachel Bukasa, Executive Director at Black Sash, Daniel Peter Al-Naddaf, Equal Education Law Center researcher, Matthew Parks, Cosatu's Parliamentary Coordinator, and economist then Dawie Roodt as well, joining us this evening.